Hi, I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World, and in this video I'm going to show you how to work with an alternate grid, or it's sometimes called a broken grid or a hidden grid. This is when you have a quilt that is something different than the usual kind of checkerboard basic grid of even squares that are all lined up. What's great about a basic grid is that it's really easy to just sew all the rows together, sew all the blocks together into rows, sew all the rows together, and you have a quilt. A broken grid or an alternate grid, it's a little bit trickier to figure out how to sew those blocks together because the seam lines don't line up into a regular checkerboard style grid. So that's what I'm going to show you here. Okay, so if you're working on a quilt that is like this one that I'm showing you here that has an offset grid or a broken grid or a hidden grid, there's a lot of different ways to talk about this. It can be tricky sometimes to figure out how you're going to sew all of those blocks together without doing any Y-seam or inset seams, which are a real pain. So on mine, I always lay them out in a way that you can sew everything together with just simple straight lines and no Y-seams. And I'm going to show you now how to break it down. So we've got a finished quilt here, and the thing you need to do first is look for a line, a seam, that intersects the quilt all the way across. You're looking for a line that goes all the way across, and it can be going sideways or it can be going up and down, and I've got my line here. So I'm going to break that part out. So I've got a line now that goes all the way from top to bottom, and you can see that I'm going to be able to sew these two chunks together without doing any Y-seams. Now let's look at the smaller one first. How am I going to put this one together? Well, if you're starting at the bottom, it's easy. You're going to sew this snap block to the owl block, to the quail block, to the cough block, to the reindeer block, and then this one here, we need to find a line that goes all the way across. So you can see that before I sew any of these blocks together, I need to sew the grr block to the tree block. So once I sew the grr to the tree, then I have a square block, and I can just sew all of these together in a stack, and I've got that one section taken care of. So now let's look over at this section. It's a lot more complicated because it's bigger, but we're going to do the same thing. We're going to look for any seam lines that go all the way across the entire thing. And I've actually got two. I've got one that goes across here and one right below it that goes across here. So what I'm going to do is put together each of these. First I'm going to put together this bottom row, and that's just going to be sewing all of these blocks together. And then I'm going to put together this next row up, which again is just sewing all of those individual blocks together. And then I'm going to sew this one to this one, the second to bottom row to the bottom row, and then I've got this rectangular chunk all ready to sew to this chunk up here. So now I need to break this chunk down. And again, I'm looking for a seam that goes all the way from edge to edge. And this time there aren't any that go across, so I'm going to start looking up and down, and I see this one. Once I break that out, that one's easy. I just need to sew the nibble to the bunny, to the squirrel, to the mushrooms, to the bear, and I've got that chunk together. So now I need to break this chunk down. And I'm looking for a seam that goes all the way, and I've got another one that goes from top to bottom here. So I need to sew the bear to the purple mushrooms, to the bunny, to the beaver, to the other grr block. So now all I've got left is this one chunk here in the middle, and I've got a whole bunch of seams that go across, but I'm going to do this one here because this breaks out this awkward block. This little chunk here is just a straight up grid. You can either sew the rows together and then sew the columns together, or you can sew each column together and then sew them together down this line. So that's an easy one for you to break down. So we needed to break out this top one, so you need to sew the snort to the raccoon to the tree, and then you've got a row there. So when I'm sewing this quilt together, I'm going to first sew this block, this grid of 6 blocks together. And then I'm going to sew this row of 3 blocks together, and I'm going to sew the snort raccoon tree block to this grid of 6, and I'll have this bigger chunk here. And then I'm going to sew this column and this column, and I'm going to sew those on either side of that center column. Then I'm going to sew these bottom 2 rows, and I'm going to join them together because then it's just a simple grid in simple straight sewing. And finally, I'm going to sew this last strip together. I'm going to sew this double block together and then sew this tall strip, and then I'm going to sew this whole tall strip to this huge chunk over here, and I'll have my finished quilt with no inset seams. So that's it. Basically, at every step along the way, it's really simple. You're just looking for a single seam line that goes from edge to edge on your quilt, whether it's going across or up and down. Just keep breaking it down, looking for those edge to edge seams, and you'll find it really easy to break that quilt up into chunks of easy to assemble grids. I'm Wendy from Shiny Happy World. I'll see you next time.